Hello, this is Peter Whitehead here, and this is another of the presentations which I produced originally for the Bromley University of the Third Age Art Appreciation Group to enable us to continue to talk about art and appreciate art during lockdown. The art group is a group of people who are interested in art, but we are by no means experts. So today I want to talk about Paul Delaroche, a French painter who specialised in history painting, but is a good illustration of the difference in approach between the neoclassicists of the 18th century and the romantics of the 19th century. He had been trained in the tradition of neoclassical history painting, which was the key genre of painting in France, the highest level as epitomized by painters such as David, and yet he was working at a time when Romanticism was starting to have a great impact, and he bridges those two movements, I think. His painting might well be familiar to you in another context. When I was a boy, very interested in history, which in those days meant British history, I had many books on the subjects, and a lot of those books were illustrated. And the illustrations in those books were very often paintings by Delaroche, no matter how historically inaccurate those paintings were. So this is Delaroche. As I said, French, born at the end of the 18th century and lived until the middle of the 19th. He grew up in the art world. His father was an art dealer. He studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. That's the kind of main training establishment in Paris for artists. Training in a very academic way based on classical works of art and the works of the High Renaissance, and then he also studied with the painter Antoine-Jean Gros, and Gros was much more influenced by Romanticism. So what we get here is a painter who is trained in the classical style, but whose choice of subject matter very often appeals to the romantic imagination. He had a slightly new approach to history painting. He didn't necessarily aim to paint a narrative painting reflecting actual events, but he wanted to capture the philosophical truth of an event. So realism needed to be adapted to reveal the underlying truth, which is not to say that he didn't spend a lot of attention to the historical details in his paintings, things like costume and location, but he felt able to adjust the historical narrative to suit the message he was trying to give through his painting. And he also adopted the conventions of religious art in his secular work, which we'll see. But it might be worth just analysing quickly the difference between the neoclassical and romantic. So classicism, neoclassicism, is the driving force through most of the 18th century, linked to the Enlightenment. Newton had proved that there were universal rules and laws which governed the universe, and his approach in the scientific field was thought to apply to everything. So this is a very static model of the universe and of culture. It was very much inspired by the works of ancient Greece and Rome. And because there was this system of rules and laws, it was very rational, it was very organized, and you could access it through the faculty of reason. It was very structured. The Romantics, who start developing in about the 1750s but become a real force in the early 1800s, say, well, that's all very good. They don't dismiss classicism, but they say there's more to it than that. What about the role of the imagination? The imagination is not subject to any rules. Where does emotion fit into this system? So they looked for wider inspiration, not just to ancient Greece and Rome. They were inspired by the Orient. They felt that the artist should not be bound by any rules, should be able to break those rules if necessary. And so this was a rather more modern and progressive way of looking at art and culture. And Romanticism is a force which applies not just to art, it applies to music, it applies to literature, it applies to poetry. It's a very significant change in the way in which people viewed the world compared with the world of the Enlightenment and the neoclassicists. So this is a typical neoclassical work by David in 1784, The Oath of the Horatii. It's a scene from Roman history. It's very highly finished, very structured. There's figures to the left, in the centre and to the right. It uses classical history and mythology to relate to current events. So this is just before the French Revolution. It shows the heroic self-sacrifice of the Horatii brothers and the grief of their wives and sisters on the right. This is stoic. This is all about Roman values. And this was a story that would have been known. The Oath of the Horatii, we possibly don't know so much about the background to this, but in the neoclassical world, this would have been a well-known event, and David illustrates it with spectacular use of light as well. But the neoclassical style could also be used for propaganda purposes. Later on, after the French Revolution, when Napoleon comes to power in 1801, he's just starting really to take over. David produces this painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps. Although there's very little sign of snow in this painting. But Napoleon is in full control of a rearing horse. The wind is blowing. On the rocks, you can just about make out in this reproduction certainly the name of Bonaparte carved on the rock, but below that, just about visible, you can see Hannibal who'd crossed the Alps and defeated the Romans in the pre-Christian era. And also the words are representing Charlemagne, so the great ruler of the area that we now call France in the first millennium, I suppose. So this is Napoleon as the heroic figure, as the man of destiny. And that really is what it represents. It's the great figure, totally in control. The Alps are no barrier to Napoleon, and there will be no other barriers. His army, which you can see in the background, will defeat everyone. But we will return to this topic later on. So to turn now to the paintings of Delaroche. This was one of Delaroche's first successes at the Salon, the death of Elizabeth I. I mentioned before that Delaroche had used religious imagery in secular paintings. Well, the form of this painting is very much like a deposition, the scene of the dead Christ brought down from the cross. So Elizabeth lying on the floor here with her arms stretched out is the Christ-like figure. in the pose of the crucified, and 3 women mourn her passing, like the 3 Marys at the foot of the cross. And there's a group of sorrowing men who stand at a distance, the disciples. So the form of the painting would have been very familiar to the viewers, but it's adopted here for a historical scene, a scene from English history, and Delaroche was very much influenced by English history. He didn't only paint English history paintings, although that's what I'm going to concentrate on today. But you can see in style you've still got the highly finished approach of the neoclassicists, the treatment of the fur, the colour, and the dark background out of which the courtiers emerge. We then move on a couple of years, an illustration of the well-known event when Oliver Cromwell goes to view the corpse of the beheaded Charles I and says, "Cruel necessity." But unfortunately, that's a 18th century invention by those who wanted to rehabilitate and raise the status of Cromwell. There's no evidence that this scene of Cromwell lifting the lid of Charles's coffin and viewing the corpse ever happened. In fact, it's very unlikely that it did. That Cromwell made himself scarce when Charles I was being beheaded. But this is all about the philosophical truth, which Delaroche wants to convey. Cromwell has been forced into this act. It's a rehabilitation of Cromwell. Cromwell, the Republican figure, has been forced to tackle the monarchy, and that had a relevance in the 1830s in France. The debate about whether France should be a monarchy or a republic. So this is a painting of the Princes in the Tower, a scene almost totally inspired by Shakespeare, because no one really knows what happened to the Princes in the Tower. Les enfants d'Edouard, so the children of Edward IV, the King Edward V and the Duke of York. In religious terms, it's a type of annunciation. So normally an annunciation is Gabriel arriving to tell Mary that she's going to have a child. And actually that is what the children are looking at in the prayer book which they're consulting. It's the annunciation. But they and the dog seem to be aware that something is about to happen. On the left hand side you can see light under the door, and there's a shadow approaching through that. This is we assume they're murderers arriving as described by Shakespeare. There's a lot of symbols. There's a Tudor rose on the bedpost. The king seems to have carved his name in the bed, and this is a very melodramatic and theatrical approach. It is much more an illustration of Shakespeare than it is an illustration of a historical event. But that's what Delaroche was about. Had an influence on later works. This is possibly a more famous painting of the Princes in the Tower by MILLAIS in 1878. MILLAIS, the pre-Raphaelite, who by this time had more or less abandoned his pre-Raphaelite brethren. But a very similar approach. The two boys, certainly the Duke of York on the left, seems to be aware that something is happening. In this case, the shadow is coming down the staircase to deal with them. but a very, I think, similar approach to that of Delaroche. I think this is probably Delaroche's most famous English history painting, The Execution of Lady Jane Grey. It's a very the painting has a great impact, but in terms of historical accuracy, again, you have to say there's lots of things wrong with the painting. Lady Jane Grey was executed on Tower Green, which is outside, not inside, and she probably wouldn't have been wearing a costume like that. But again, you see, that's not what's important. The important thing is you have the figure, the virginal figure of Lady Jane Grey, the victim, in the centre, all in white, reaching, she's blindfolded, reaching for the block, being assisted by, I think that's the Constable of the Tower, while the headsman waits on with his axe, ready to do his job, and Lady Jane Grey's attendant ladies faint and swoon in the background. So the impact we're looking for here is a dramatic impact, not necessarily a representation of what actually happened at the execution of Lady Jane Grey. It's a very popular painting at the National Gallery these days. If you go to the National Gallery, you always see lots of people looking at this. It's a very big painting, but it has a strange history. If you'd gone to the National Gallery before 1975, you wouldn't have seen this painting on display. Much of Delaroche's work was considered in the 20th century to be stale, outmoded and irrelevant. And in fact, this painting had been recorded as destroyed in a flood at the Tate in the 1920s and was rediscovered more or less by accident. They were looking for other paintings, unrolled them and found this painting rolled up, damaged, yes, but not destroyed. But it was not considered worthy of display for most of the 20th century. And even when it was put in the exhibition in 1975, it was partly to illustrate how irrelevant this style of painting was, and then much to the National Gallery's surprise, it became the star of the show, and it's been on display ever since. Delaroche himself turned to religious paintings in the late 1830s. They didn't really succeed with the critics, and he stopped exhibiting in 1837. He concentrated on other art forms during the 1840s, which we'll have a look at in a minute, but I think it's probably worthwhile returning to Napoleon to see how Delaroche treats the same subject as David. Here we have Bonaparte crossing the Alps, so entirely the same subject. By 1850, Napoleon's safely dead. You don't have to depict him heroically. Napoleon here is being guided over the Alps, which are absolutely covered with snow. He's not riding a rearing horse. He's riding a mule. He has a guide to help him. He's not in control of the situation. So there's quite a different approach to the figure of Napoleon and what you're trying to say about him, and you compare the two alongside each other. I think you can see the heroic nature of the neoclassical approach against the much more realistic nature of the approach that is inspired by Romanticism on the right. From 1837 to 1841, Delaroche painted the Hémicycle in the salon at the École des Beaux-Arts, where he'd studied. So this is the space in the École where awards would have been handed out, and 70 of the most famous artists of antiquity gazed down at their descendants in a 27-metre panorama. This is an oil painting onto the wall. So artists of all periods stand dressed in the clothes of their own time, conversing with each other. So you have groups from the left. There's a group of painters who are colorists, so painters who were renowned for their use of colour. Then you have a set of sculptors. The centre panel we'll have a look at in detail in a minute. To the right of the centre you have architects, and then more painters on the far right, and these are painters who were renowned for their drawing skills, for their draftsmanship. Interestingly, or perhaps not interestingly, as expected, no female artists in here, but it does represent the unity of the arts, so painting, sculpture and architecture all considered as one art form, and that's replicated in the centre figures. So here we have the three gentlemen in the background sitting on chairs. Those are the three creators of the Parthenon in Athens: the architect Phidias, the sculptor Ictius, and the painter Apelles. Those are the figures seated. They're attended by the inspirational muses of various periods of art. So there's Gothic art, there's Greek art, there's Roman art, and there's Renaissance art. And the muse handing out the laurel wreaths in the centre, crowning the people who are receiving awards. So that's a quick look at the work of Paul Delaroche, and as I say, I think it's a very good illustration. He's a very good illustration of the changes that Romanticism started to introduce in the early half of the 19th century. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this talk. There are other talks available on my YouTube channel, which is called Art for Art's Sake, and there is a link on the screen there which you can follow to watch other talks. Thank you very much for listening to this one.